The hospital hallway was almost empty when I saw him sitting alone in a wheelchair. His hands were trembling. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His face looked exhausted, and there was a small bandage above his eyebrow. But what broke my heart wasn't the injury. It was the way he kept staring at the elevator doors, waiting for someone who never came. His name was Richard Anderson. He was my father-in-law. And for 3 days, nobody from his own family had come to see him. Not his son, not his daughter, not even the grandchildren he had spent years supporting. I was the only one sitting beside him. And I still remember the moment he looked at me and whispered, "Drive me to my lawyer." I thought the pain medication was making him confused. I had no idea those 3 words were about to destroy everything his family thought they knew about him. 3 days earlier, my husband Daniel called me from the hospital. His voice sounded nervous. "Emma, Dad had an accident." My heart dropped. "What happened?" "He fell down the stairs. The doctors say he needs surgery." "Is he okay?" There was a long silence. Then Daniel said, "He'll be fine." I asked him when we should go. Another silence. "Actually, I can't come today." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Daniel, your father is in the hospital." "I know." "You should be there." "I have meetings." I stared at my phone. Meetings? His father was lying in a hospital bed, and he was talking about meetings. "Daniel, I'll go." He sighed. "Fine, but don't stay too long." I didn't understand what he meant until I reached the hospital. I found Richard alone. He looked at me and forced a smile. "Emma." I walked toward him. "Dad?" He immediately looked behind me. "Where's Daniel?" I swallowed. He couldn't come. Richard's smile disappeared. And Sarah? Sarah was Richard's daughter. She couldn't come either. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected it. Then he looked down at his hands. "I see." I sat beside him. "What happened?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Did Daniel tell you about my surgery?" "Yes." Richard looked into my eyes. "There won't be any surgery." I froze. "What?" "The doctor said I don't need it anymore." "Then that's good news." He shook his head. "No, Emma, it's not." His voice became quiet. "They've given up on me." I couldn't understand. "Who?" "My family." That night, I stayed beside Richard. Around midnight, his nurse came in with some paperwork. She looked at Richard. "Mr. Anderson, your discharge arrangements still haven't been confirmed." Richard frowned. "What arrangements?" "The person who was supposed to take you home hasn't responded." I looked at him. "Who was supposed to pick him up?" The nurse hesitated. "His son." Richard closed his eyes. I could see the pain on his face. Not physical pain. Something much deeper. He had spent his entire life building a family. And now, when he needed them most, they had disappeared. I reached for his hand. "Dad, I'll take you home." He opened his eyes. "No." "Why not?" "Because my home isn't my home anymore." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't push him. The next morning, I called Daniel. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. Then I called Sarah. She finally picked up. "Emma, what is it?" "Your father is still in the hospital." "I know. He needs someone." "Emma, I'm busy." "Sarah, he's your father." There was silence. Then she said something I will never forget. "Dad has enough money to take care of himself." And she hung up. I stared at the phone. I couldn't believe it. Richard had spent decades taking care of everyone. He had paid for Daniel's college. He had helped Sarah buy her first house. He had even paid off Daniel's business debt twice. And now they were treating him like a burden. On the 3rd day, something changed. I walked into Richard's room and found him sitting upright. His face looked different. Calm. Focused. He was no longer the broken man I had seen 2 days before. He looked like someone who had finally made a decision. He looked at me. "Emma." "Yes." "Do you trust me?" I nodded. "With my life." He smiled. Then he leaned closer. "Drive me to my lawyer." I blinked. "Your lawyer?" "Yes." "Why?" He looked toward the door. "Because my family believes I'm dying." My heart started beating faster. And he smiled. They're wrong. I helped Richard leave the hospital. We drove in silence for almost 20 minutes. Finally, I couldn't hold back. Dad, what is going on? He looked out the window. My family thinks I'm weak. Why would they think that? Because I allowed them to. I looked at him. What does that mean? Richard sighed. After my wife died, I changed my will. My eyes widened. Your will? Yes. Does Daniel know? No. Does Sarah know? No. He smiled sadly. They only know what they believe they're going to inherit. We arrived at a large law office downtown. Richard walked inside without hesitation. An elderly attorney immediately stood up. Richard. They shook hands. Then the lawyer looked at me. And you must be Emma. I nodded. Richard sat down. Michael, show her everything. The lawyer opened a large folder. Inside were bank statements, property documents, company records, and legal papers. I looked at Richard. What is all this? He said quietly, everything my family thinks belongs to them. My hand started shaking. Then Michael said, Richard's estate is worth considerably more than his family believes. I stared at him. How much? Michael looked at Richard. Richard nodded. Tell her. The lawyer took a breath. Approximately $42 million. I couldn't speak. $42 million. Daniel had always told me his father was wealthy, but I never imagined this. Richard leaned forward. But that's not the shocking part. Michael opened another document. This is... Richard had secretly placed almost all of his assets into a family trust. But there was one condition. His children would only receive their inheritance if they continued to care for him and remained involved in his life. If they abandoned him, the inheritance would disappear. I stared at Richard. You knew they might do this? I suspected it. Then why didn't you tell them? Because I needed to know whether they loved me or my money. Tears filled his eyes. And now I know. I felt sick, so they failed the test. Richard nodded. They didn't just fail. He looked at Michael. They made their choice. The lawyer opened another file. Richard's new estate plan. It was completely different. But then Richard said something I never expected. Emma, I want you to sign something. Me? Yes. What? He pushed the document toward me. I read the first page. My eyes widened. Dad, this says I'm the beneficiary. He nodded. Of the trust. I immediately pushed it back. No. Richard frowned. Why? Because I don't owe your family's money. He smiled. That's exactly why I want you to have it. I shook my head. No. Daniel is your son. Richard's face became serious. My son abandoned me. Maybe he's just scared. No. His voice cracked. I raised him better than this. He looked down. When your mother-in-law died, I promised her I'd protect our children. He paused. But I forgot something. What? That protecting someone doesn't mean protecting them from the consequences of their choices. That afternoon, Richard returned home. I expected Daniel and Sarah to come running. They didn't. Instead, the house was empty. Richard walked into his study. Everything was exactly where he had left it. Family photographs, awards, old letters, his wife's portrait. He stared at the portrait for a long time. Then he whispered, I finally understand. I asked him what he meant. He pointed toward the photograph. She always told me Daniel and Sarah loved me. He smiled sadly. She was wrong. No, Dad. He looked at me. Sometimes people love what you provide, not who you are. That evening, Daniel finally called. Emma, where are you? At Dad's house. What are you doing there? Taking care of him. Daniel became irritated. I told you not to get involved. I couldn't believe it. Your father was abandoned in a hospital. He wasn't abandoned. He was... Emma, you don't understand. Then explain it. Silence. Finally, he said, Dad has always been manipulative. I felt something break inside me. Manipulative? Yes. He raised you. So... He paid your college tuition. He had money. He saved your business. He owed me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Then Daniel said, "Just stay out of the family situation." I hung up. Richard had heard everything. He looked at me. "Now you understand." I nodded. "Yes." The next morning, Richard called a family meeting. Daniel came. Sarah came. They sat across from their father. Neither looked worried. In fact, Sarah smiled. "Dad, we heard you're changing your will." Richard looked at her. "Who told you?" She hesitated. "A friend." Richard smiled. "I see." Daniel leaned forward. "Dad, we're your children." Richard nodded. "Yes." "And everything you built belongs to the family." Richard looked at him. "No." Daniel froze. "What?" "It belongs to me." Sarah became angry. "You can't do this." Richard calmly replied, "I already did." He placed the documents on the table. Michael, his lawyer, entered the room. Daniel's face went pale. "What's he doing here?" Richard said, "He's here because I want you both to hear the truth." Michael opened the file. Richard Anderson's estate has been placed under a new trust. Sarah laughed nervously. "So?" Michael looked at her. "The beneficiaries have been changed." Daniel's face changed. "Changed to who?" Michael looked toward me. "To Emma." Silence. Complete silence. Sarah stared at me. "You." I didn't say anything. Daniel stood up. "You're giving her everything?" Richard looked directly at his son. "No." Daniel smiled. Then Richard continued. "I'm giving her what you were never willing to earn." Daniel's smile disappeared. "Dad." Richard raised his hand. "No more excuses." He looked at both children. "I spent 3 days in that hospital." His voice trembled. 3 days. "I waited for you." Sarah looked down. Richard continued. "I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking you to solve anything. I only wanted my children to walk through that hospital door." His eyes filled with tears. "And neither of you came." Daniel tried to speak, but Richard stopped him. "You thought I was dying." Daniel's face turned pale. "You thought that if I died, you would inherit everything." Richard leaned back. "But you made one mistake." Daniel whispered. "What?" Richard looked at him. "I didn't die." Nobody spoke. Then Richard picked up another document. "This is the second part of my estate plan." Michael nodded. Richard said, "Every dollar that would have gone to you and Sarah has now been transferred to a foundation." Sarah's eyes widened. "What foundation?" Richard looked at me. "The Richard Anderson Foundation for Abandoned Elderly Patients." Sarah began crying. "You can't do this." Richard's voice was calm. "I can." "You're punishing us." "No." He looked at her. "You punish yourselves." Daniel suddenly sat down. His anger disappeared. He looked like a little boy. "Dad." Richard stared at him. "I loved you." Daniel started crying. "I know." "No," Richard whispered. "You don't." "I loved you so much that I kept giving you chances." He wiped his eyes. "But you only came back when you needed something." Daniel lowered his head. Richard looked toward the door. "I'm finished." Daniel stood. "Dad, please." Richard didn't answer. Daniel walked out. Sarah followed. Neither looked back. I thought that was the end. But Richard wasn't finished. A month later, he returned to the hospital, not as a patient, as a donor. He donated millions to create a program that ensured elderly patients would never be left alone after discharge. He hired social workers. He funded transportation. He created emergency housing. And he personally visited patients who had nobody. One afternoon, I found him sitting beside an elderly woman. She was crying. Richard held her hand. "You're not alone," he told her. Those words reminded me of the night I first found him. 3 days. Nobody came. Except me. 6 months later, Daniel came to our house. He looked completely different. No expensive suit. No arrogance. Just a tired man standing at the door. He looked at Richard. "Dad." Richard said nothing. Daniel swallowed. "I don't want your money." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I don't." "No." Daniel looked down. "I want my father back." Richard remained silent for a long time. Then he asked, "Why?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Because I finally realized what I lost. Richard stood. You didn't lose your inheritance. Daniel nodded. I know. You lost the opportunity to love me when I needed you. Daniel cried. I know. Richard walked toward him. For a moment, I thought he would hug him, but he stopped. Trust isn't rebuilt with words. Daniel nodded. I understand. Then prove it. Daniel nodded again, and for the first time in years, he didn't ask for anything. He simply stayed. A year later, Rich's foundation had helped thousands of elderly people, and something unexpected happened. Daniel began working there, not for money, not for inheritance. He started driving elderly patients to appointments. He started visiting people who had no family. He started doing the exact thing he had refused to do for his own father. One evening, Richard watched him help an old man into a car. I stood beside Richard. You're proud of him. Richard smiled. A little. Do you forgive him? Richard thought for a moment. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. He looked toward his son. It's deciding that someone else's mistake won't control the rest of your life. Then he looked at me. And sometimes karma isn't about destroying people. What is it about? Richard smiled. It's about letting them finally understand what they threw away. Years later, Richard's story became known throughout the city. People called him generous. Some called him brilliant. Others called him ruthless. But I knew the truth. He wasn't trying to destroy his children. He simply wanted one answer. A simple answer. Did they love him? Or did they love what he could give them? And when the answer became clear, he chose himself. The man they thought was weak. The man they abandoned in a hospital. The man they believed had nothing left to give. Was actually 10 steps ahead of them. But the greatest thing Richard ever gained wasn't the money. It wasn't the revenge. It wasn't even the foundation. It was something much more valuable. He finally learned that family isn't always determined by blood. Sometimes family is the person who sits beside you when everyone else walks away. And sometimes the person you never expected to be there becomes a person who changes your entire life. Richard looked at me one final time and smiled. You stayed. I smiled back. Of course I stayed. He nodded. That's why you were always family. And that was a secret they never understood. They thought they abandoned a helpless old man. They didn't realize they had abandoned the one person who had the power to change their entire future.